Hello everyone and welcome back to the Learning Deep Learning series where I'm going to go over this blog and try to learn as well as explain the things which I'm reading. So in the last video we had done some portion of gradient descent, however I want to restart it primarily due to the reason that in the last video there were quite a lot of disturbances. Uh, there was some alarm clock ringing and all, and also I think I did not do a really good job explaining some stuff because I was in a hurry as well. So I'll begin again with learning with gradient descent. So I expect that you know up until this point whatever we've covered. So now that we have a design for our neural network, how can it learn to recognize digits? The first thing we'll need is a data set to learn from, a so-called training data set. So we'll use the MNIST data set. So this is a very popular dataset which contains tens of thousands of scanned images of handwritten digits together with their correct classification. MNIST's name comes from the fact that it is a modified subset of two datasets collected by NIST, the United States National Institute of Standards and Technology. So here are some images from the MNIST dataset. So MNIST dataset comes in two parts. It has 60,000 training images, and these were scanned handwriting samples from 250 people, half of whom were US Census Bureau employees, and the other half were high school students. And the images are 28 by 28 pixels, grayscale inside and grayscale. And the second part of the MNIST dataset is 10,000 images belonging to the test set, and again they are 28 by 28 grayscale images. So why do we have a separate test set? So to show that this is the MNIST database, like this is the official website, and you will see that there are different models which people have tried out, and they've mentioned what error rate they got. So you can see that they someone reported a 12% error in 1998, and if you go down below, you'll see in 2012 the error was as low as 0.23, right? So, what really happens is when you have a fixed test set, everyone reports their error on the same data set. It's not like they are making the test set on their own. However, instead, if you had like only a training set and people had to make the test set themselves out of the training set, then they could be randomly generated, and they would not be as comparable as they are right now. Right now the test sets are fixed, and everyone reporting their errors and their observations and their model performance reports them on the same test set, making them comparable. So I hope you got that point. We'll use the notation x to denote a training input. It would be convenient to regard each training input x as a 28 by 28 or a 784 dimensional vector. So just to reiterate what this really means, it means that each pixel is now a entry of the vector. So you have 784 pixels, so you have 784 entries in the vector. And each entry in the vector represents the grayscale value for a single pixel in the image. I hope this makes sense. We'll denote the corresponding output y as y of x, where y is a 10-dimensional vector. For example, if the output is 6, then you would get this as the output. So now you'll see this t is nothing but the transpose. So instead of thinking of this as like a row, this is a column in the traditional sense of vectors. So you can see only the entry corresponding to 6, so 0 1 2 3 4 5 6 is a 1, and rest all are 0. So this means that at this moment the model predicts that the image is a 6. So T is the transpose, so it makes it into a column vector. So now what we'd like is an algorithm which lets us find the weights and biases so that the output from the network approximates y of x for all training inputs x. And to quantify how well we are achieving this goal, we define a cost function. Okay, so we'll go over all of this in a bit. Just bear with me. This might seem a bit intimidating, but if you're familiar with mean square error, this look a lot similar to that. And if you just remove this 2 for a while and do not think about this 2, this is exactly the same formula as the mean squared error. If you don't believe me, let's just look up mean squared error here. This formula is exactly the same as the formula we have here. Y of x is yi, which is the observed value. the predicted value, and the total number of data points, and so on. So this is the cost function which we're using. Another side note, this is sometimes also referred to as a loss or objective function. So in this book, they're using the term cost function, but you will find loss function also written almost any blog or anywhere you look it up. Objective function is like rarer, but I've seen it in some research papers. Okay, so W is the collection of all weights in the network, B all the biases, and N is the total number of training inputs. A is the vector of outputs from the network when X is input, and the sum is all over all the training input X. So of course the output A depends on X, W and B, but to keep the notation simple, they haven't explicitly indicated this dependence. So y of x is essentially or is an outcome of a combination of w, x and b, but they've just substituted it as y of x. So the notation norm of v, this is known as norm of v, this just denotes the usual length function for a vector. So if you've studied vectors, you'll know that this is also known as the mod or the length of the vector. We'll call c the quadratic cost function. It is also sometimes known as the mean squared error or just MSE. Inspecting the form of the quadratic cost function, we see that c of wb is non-negative. So how do we conclude this? Before reading, you can also get the intuition from here. You are getting a sum of square entries, right? So at max, all of these can be zero. They cannot be negative. Neither one of them, not even a single one of them, can be negative. So a sum of non-negative quantities is always non-negative. So the minimum value of this function would be a zero. It can never be negative. So further, the cost function becomes small when y of x is approximately equal to the output a for all training inputs x. So a is the actual output, y of x is the output which you get, and the closer they are, the smaller the value will be, and the smaller the value of the cost function will be. Make sense? So our training algorithm has done a good job if it can find weights and biases such that the cost function approximates to zero. So this is essentially what we are going to do. We are trying to optimize the weights and biases in such a fashion that a cost function approximates to zero. And in vice versa, if the cost function is large, then it means that the predicted and the actual outputs are not at all similar, and for a large number of inputs, and hence the training algorithm will have to work again and try to optimize the weights and biases. And so this seems simple, right? We now know what we want. We want to minimize this function, and minimizing this function just means we are bringing the predicted and the actual outputs closer. You aren't going to change the actual outputs, you're just going to tweak the model to change the predicted outputs. And to do this, the algorithm used is called gradient descent. So before getting into that, why introduce the quadratic cost? After all, aren't we primarily interested in the number of images classified correctly by the network? Why not try to maximize the number directly rather than minimizing a proxy measure like the quadratic cost? You might have this question, and this is a very valid question. The problem with that is the number of images correctly classified is not a smooth function of the weights and biases in the network. So you can see that the quadratic cost function depends on the weights and biases. However, the number of images classified correctly does not directly depend on them. It is not a smooth function like the quadratic cost function. So for the most part, making small changes to the weights and biases won't cause any change at all in the number of training images classified correctly. So that makes it difficult to figure out how to change the weights and biases to get improved performance. So suppose you make a slight change, and due to that slight change, no change in the classified images, number of classified images observed. Earlier also only 20 out of 1000 were classified correctly, and even after a small tweak, 20 out of 1000 are classified correctly. So the model will not know what really to do. However, when you turn to the cost function, you will know have the values come closer or gone far apart, and make tweaks as per the need. If we use a smooth cost function like the quadratic cost, it turns out to be easy to figure out how to make small changes in the weights and biases so as to get an improvement in the cost. That's why we focus first on minimizing the quadratic cost, and only after that we will examine the classification accuracy. So I hope this makes sense. Even given that we want to use a smooth cost function, you may still wonder why we chose the quadratic cost function. Isn't this a rather ad hoc choice? Perhaps if we chose a different cost function, we'd get a totally different set of minimizing weights and biases, and this is a valid concern. And later he says that he will revisit the cost function and make some modifications. However, the quadratic cost function works perfectly well for understanding the basics of learning in neural networks, so we'll stick with it for now. Also, I think I forgot to like tell you what this 2 is. This 2 is nothing but for calculation simplicity. So if you read up why this 2 is there, you will find out that this 2 is just there so when you take the derivative, these 2's get cancelled out. Okay, so moving ahead. So recapping, our goal in training a network is to find weights and biases which minimize the quadratic cost function, C of W and B. This is a well-posed problem, but it's got a lot of distracting structure as currently posed. The interpretation of W and B as weights and biases, the sigmoid function lurking in the background, the choice of network architecture, MNIST, and so on. It turns out that we can understand a tremendous amount by ignoring most of the structure and just concentrating on the minimization aspect. So we'll turn our focus only to minimizing the cost function. We're not going to think about everything at the same time, but we'll focus on the task at hand. So for now, we're going to forget all about the specific form of the cost function, the connection to the neural network, and so on. Instead, we are going to imagine that we've simply been given a function. We are going to develop a technique called gradient descent, which can be used to solve such a minimization problem. Then we'll come back to the specific function we want to minimize for neural networks. Okay, I hope this makes sense because this was pretty straightforward, I believe. So let's suppose we're trying to minimize the cost function C of V. This could be any real valued function of many variables where V is V1, V2 and so on. And so the author has replaced W and B notation by V to emphasize that this could be any function. We're not specifically thinking in the context of neural networks anymore. So to minimize C of V, it helps us to imagine C as a function of just two variables, which we'll call V1 and V2. So this is a plot of C with respect to V1 and V2. So if C depends only on V1 and V2, then you'll know if V1 is say 0 and V2 is also 0, you'll get the value of C at that point. If V2 is 1 and V1 is 1 as well, you'll get the value of C at that point. So what we'd like to find is to find where C achieves its global minimum. Now, of course, for a function plotted, we can eyeball the graph and find the minimum. In that sense, I've perhaps shown slightly too simple a function. A general function C may be a complicated function of many variables, and it wouldn't be possible to just eyeball the graph to find the minimum. So one way of attacking the problem is to use calculus and to try find the minimum analytically. We could compute derivatives and then try using them to find places where C is an extremum. With some luck, that might work when C is a function of just one or a few variables. But it will turn into a nightmare when we have many more variables. And for neural networks, we will often want far more variables. The biggest neural networks have cost functions which depend on billions of weights and biases in an extremely complicated fashion. So using calculus to minimize that just won't work. So this paragraph just tells you why the calculus approach might work for a very small case, but in general, when we deal with large cases, calculus directly to find the minimum using derivatives is not going to help you. Okay, so this is a side note. After asserting that we'll gain insight by imagining C as a function of just two variables, I have turned around twice in two paragraphs and said, hey, but what if it's a function of many more than two variables? Sorry about that. Please believe me when I say that it really does help to imagine C as a function of two variables. We saw that the plot which we got, had he taken like 100 variables, we wouldn't have got any meaningful plot which us humans could understand. So it just happens that sometimes the picture breaks down, and the last two paragraphs were dealing with such breakdowns. Good thinking about mathematics often involves juggling multiple intuitive pictures, learning when it's appropriate to use each picture and when it's not. So I feel this is a very powerful paragraph, and this tells you a lot about in general when you study stuff. You'll see that books start off with very simple examples, which are often very trivial also, and the problem sets are often much more difficult than the examples which you began off with. But those basic examples are sort of the building blocks which help you build the intuition to go into higher dimensions, to deal with much more variables. Okay, so now that we established that calculus doesn't work, there is another beautiful analogy which suggests an algorithm which works pretty well. So we start by thinking of our function as kind of a valley, and this is not a claim far from reality. This does look like if you had a more complex function, you might be able to visualize that there could be valley-like structures or such structures. Okay, so if you squint just a little at the plot above, that shouldn't be too hard. And we imagine a ball rolling down the slope of the valley. Our everyday experience tells us that the ball will eventually roll to the bottom of the valley. Perhaps we can use this idea as a way to find a minimum for the function. We randomly choose a starting point for an imaginary ball and then simulate the motion of the ball as it is rolled down to the bottom of the valley. We could do this simulation simply by computing derivatives and perhaps some second derivatives of c. Those derivatives would tell us everything we need to know about the local shape of the valley and therefore how our ball should roll. So I hope this makes sense because this was just an analogy. We are trying to say that we might think of this as rolling a ball down a valley, and wherever the ball ends up stopping is the lowest point because then it can't go any lower. So, based on what I've written, you might suppose that we'll be trying to write down Newton's equations of motion for a ball, considering the effects of friction and gravity and so on. Actually, we're not going to take the ball rolling analogy quite that seriously. We are devising an algorithm to minimize C, not developing an accurate simulation of the laws of physics. The balls I view is meant to simulate our imagination, not constrain our thinking. So rather than getting into the messy details of physics, let us simply ask ourselves, if we were declared God for a day and could make up our own laws of physics dictating to the ball how it should roll, what law or laws of motion could we pick that would make it so that the ball always rolled to the bottom of the valley? So in the previous paragraph, he gave an analogy of the ball, but in the next paragraph he mentions that we are not going to take it seriously as at its face value. We are not going to make a simulation to do all this stuff. Rather, we are just getting some sort of intuition about what the algorithm is planning to do. Okay, so to make this question more precise, let us think about what happens when we move the ball a small amount delta v1 in the v1 direction and a small amount delta v2 in the v2 direction. So calculus tells us C changes as following. So if you've done calculus, you'll know that this is very commonly used in calculus, these sorts of approximations and stuff. So I don't really know how I can explain this, but I hope this makes sense. So the change in C is the partial derivative of C with respect to V1 times the change in V1 plus the partial derivative of C with respect to V2 times the change in V2. So we are now going to find a way of choosing V1, change in V1 and change in V2. I'll call them delta V1, delta V2, so as to make delta C negative. That is, we'll choose a way them so the ball is rolling down the valley. So when delta C is negative, it just means that the slope is negative, and a negative slope, if you've worked with tangents, you can sort of visualize that it would be a graph in such a fashion. So let me just draw. So if this is something and you have a peak like this, right? So the slope here in this region is positive and the slope here in this region is negative. So you can see while you're going down, the slope is negative because the angle is measured from here and the angle is greater than 90 degrees, and the tangent of something greater than 90 degrees and less than 180 degrees is negative. Okay. So to figure out how such a choice is, it helps us to define delta V to be the vector of changes in V. So you've made a new vector delta V, which is just a vector which has the entries delta V1 and delta V2. So the transpose is being taken, I guess, because otherwise the formatting would be too awkward, turning row vectors into column. We'll also define a gradient of C to be a vector of partial derivatives. So you can have delta, the partial derivative of C with respect to V1 and C with respect to V2 as the other, or the other thing as the gradient of C. So these two terms are the gradients of C, and this is represented as this using this symbol. So if you're not familiar with this symbol, I believe this is known as nabla in maths, del or nabla. Yep. So just to open this up, this is the nabla notation. So, but I'm going to refer to this as the gradient of C. So gradient of C is another vector. So in a moment we will rewrite the change delta C in terms of delta V and the gradient uh, C, gradient of C. Before getting to that, though, I want to clarify something that sometimes people get hung up on the gradient. When meeting the gradient C notation for the first time, people sometimes wonder how should they think about the gradient symbol. What exactly does gradient mean? In fact, it's perfectly fine to think of gradient C as a single mathematical object, the vector defined above, which happens to be written using two symbols. In this point of view, gradient is just a piece of notational flag waving, telling you, hey, gradient C is a gradient vector. There are more advanced points of view where gradient can be viewed as an independent mathematical entity in its own right, for example, as a differential operator, but we won't need such points of view. So this one was, I believe, pretty self-explanatory. So now what they've done is rewritten the change in C as a dot product of the gradient of C and the change in V. And if you're familiar with dot products, you'll know that if you open this up, this can be expressed as a matrix multiplication of two, where one of them is transposed, I believe, and then if you work out a matrix multiplication, you will get exactly this. So this equation helps us explain why gradient of C is called a gradient vector. Gradient of C relates changes in V to the change in C. As you can see, a change in V and a change in C are related by this. So this is actually what the gradient of slope also does. But what's really exciting about the equation is that it lets us see how to choose delta V so as to make delta C negative. So in particular, suppose we chose delta V as this thing. So I'll explain what this is. You have the gradient of C multiplied by a constant, and you've taken the negative of all of that. So now the constant is designed to be small and positive. So this small positive parameter is the learning rate, and if you substitute this back into the equation, you'll get that the change in C is the gradient of C squared times a negative value times a small constant. Since this value is greater than 0 and this value is also greater than 0, you are guaranteed that the change in C will be less than or equal to 0. So C can never increase, only decrease or stay constant at max. So if we change V according to the prescriptions in equation 10, within of course the limit of approximations, because this equation is an approximation. You cannot take outright like very large values and stuff. So this is the property which we are looking for, the law for the motion of the ball, and how we'll explain in a bit. We'll use the equation to compute a value for delta V and then move the position of the ball V by that amount. So you will move the ball from V to a position V prime or V dash, which is V minus this quantity. So essentially, you're using this as your rule. This is how you're going to update again and again till you reach a point where you are no longer going to update. And we hope that that point is the global minimum. So summing up, the way gradient descent algorithm works is it repeatedly computes the derivatives gradient of C and then moves in the opposite direction, falling down the slope of the valley. and we can visualize it like this. So you begin here, then go a bit here, then again here, again here, again here, and move in small intervals. Now here you can understand why the learning rate eta is small. If the learning rate eta was large, then you will make large jumps. So you might make a jump so large, you might just end up skipping the global minimum altogether and reach the other end. So that it doesn't really help the model converge. Notice that with this rule, gradient descent doesn't reproduce real physical motion. In real life, a ball has momentum, and that momentum may allow it to roll across the slope or even momentarily roll uphill. It's only after the effects of friction set in that the ball is guaranteed to roll down the valley. By contrast, for choosing delta V just says go down right now. That's still a pretty good rule for finding the minimum. So I hope you got this part. Okay. To make gradient descent work correctly, we need to choose the learning rate eta to be small enough that equation 9 is a good approximation. If we don't, we might end up with a change in c greater than 0, which obviously would not be good. At the same time, we don't want eta to be too small, since then we would be taking very tiny jumps. So in practical implementations, when you are looking for a good learning rate, you often vary the learning rate and look for the point where the learning rate fits the best. So we, as the author tells us, we'll have a look at this as well later. So I've explained gradient descent when c is a function of just two variables, but in fact everything works just as well when c is a function of many more variables. So suppose in particular that c is a function of m variables v1 to vm. Uh, I'll have there's someone at the door. I'll be back in a second. So hi, sorry for that disturbance. There was someone at the door. I'll I'll restart from here. I've explained gradient descent when c is a function of just two variables. But in fact, everything works just as well when c is a function of many more variables. Suppose in particular that c is a function of m variables, then the change delta c in c produced by a small change delta v is delta c approximates this, where the gradient of c is this vector. This is just an extension of the two-dimensional case. And similarly, you'll get this same expression as above. So I won't explain this one as again, and you'll get the update rule to be the same as the update rule which you had above, just now you're updating in higher dimensions. So you can think of this update rule as defining the gradient descent algorithm. It gives us a way of repeatedly changing the position v in order to find the minimum of the function c. The rule doesn't always work. Several things can go wrong and prevent gradient descent from finding the global minimum of c. A point we'll return to explore in later chapters. But in practice, gradient descent often works extremely well, and in neural networks, we'll find that it's a powerful way of minimizing the cost function, so helping the net learn. Indeed, there's even a sense in which gradient descent is the optimal strategy for searching a minimum. Let us suppose that we're trying to make a move delta v in the position so as to decrease c as much as possible. This is equivalent to minimizing this expression. We'll constrain the size of the move so that delta v is equal to epsilon for some small fixed epsilon greater than 0. In other words, we want to make a move that is a small step of fixed size, and we're trying to find a movement direction instead, which decreases c as much as possible. It can be proved that the choice of delta v, which minimizes the gradient of c dot delta v, is this, and where eta is the constant epsilon divided by the modulo of the gradient of this, and it is a gradient of the norm of the gradient of c, and it is determined by the size constraint. The norm of v delta v is epsilon. So gradient descent can be viewed as a way of taking small steps in the direction which does the most immediately decrease. So if you try to think about this now, we now have the size of the step. Rather, we're trying to find the direction, and in some sense, they show that uh, they're trying to tell us that this is the optimal strategy for searching for a minimum, and how is what they've explained right here. So if you didn't get this, I would suggest reading this again, or like getting a pen and paper and making some stuff up. So we'll have a look at the proof of the assertion in the last paragraph. So the proof uses the Cauchy-Squarz inequality, And if you want to try to prove it yourself first, then you can like go ahead read about the Cauchy-Squarce inequality. But since I'll show you the proof. I found this proof on Stack Exchange, which is quite an easy proof to follow along. So we want to minimize this function, right, by finding some value for delta v that does the trick. So we are assuming that the norm of v is epsilon for some epsilon belonging to a real number set greater than 0, and this is the fixed step size. And now we want to find out how should we move v, what should delta v be to decrease c as much as possible. And the optimal strategy is that, like, this is what we want to prove, that delta v is negative eta times the gradient of c, where eta is epsilon divided by the length of the gradient of c, or delta v is, if you substitute everything, the negative epsilon times the gradient of c divided by the length of the gradient of c. So what is the proof? So first of all, this is the basic of Cauchy-Squarce inequality. The dot using the Cauchy-Squarce inequality, we can show that the dot the modulus of the dot of two is always less than or equal to the individual modulus and their product. So this means that the minimum of this is the negative of this. How does this make sense, you might ask? So this is the modulus, right? So if the modulus of x is less than equal to 2, then x belongs to negative 2 to positive 2, right? So the minimum value of x then would be negative 2. Using similar rationale, you can see that the minimum value of this expression is the negative of the norm of gradient of c times the times delta v, the norm of delta v. So by substitution, you can now substitute some stuff here. You had this for the minimum, and then you can substitute this term to be epsilon as we had above. So now we consider the following. If you take the dot of something with itself, it gives you the its square, right? And if you divide it with one of them, you will still have the norm on the other side. So this is some standard property of vectors and gradients. And now once you have this equation, you just have to multiply negative epsilon on both sides. Once you multiply negative epsilons on both sides, you will get negative epsilon times this term is negative epsilon times this term, which is the norm of gradient of c. And this might seem familiar, right? Because this is what we're trying to show. Notice that the right hand side of the equality is same as that in equation 2. So you've basically attained this same term in both of these places. So now you can equate these two terms. So you rewrite the left hand side of equation 4 to separate one of the deltas gradient c's. The other term will be our delta v, such that the gradient of c times delta of v is equal to negative epsilon times the gradient of c. So you can see that they've taken out one term here, and because the Cauchy-Squarce inequality told us that the minimum could be by considering this, we know that delta v must be this term. So essentially what they've done is you have the same right hand side. So let's just ignore it. They've taken out one piece of gradient c. So the remaining portion must be the same, right? So delta v is this term for the function to be minimized, and that is all there is to it. So I'll have a link to this solution so that you can have a read. There are other proofs as well, and I believe this is the same, and there are some proofs in the comments as well, so you can read up on them and maybe get a proof of your own. So I explained the other question is, I explained gradient descent when c is a function of two variables, and when it's a function of more than two variables. What happens when c is just a function of one variable? Can you provide a geometric interpretation of what gradient descent is doing in the one-dimensional case? And I believe this is a lot simpler than the other question. So if I take the brush, in the one-dimensional case, like in the two-dimensional case, you had a plane and then a figure in space and all that stuff, right? And you had a figure in space. But in the one-dimensional case, there is nothing of this sort. In the one-dimensional case, you will have something like this for a simple case, and the ball would just be going down like this. And as the functions become more complex, maybe the function is this, and then you might want to reach this point, and so on. So this is the one-dimensional case, and this is what happens in the one-dimensional case. Okay. So now let's have a look at this. People have investigated many variations of gradient descent, including variations that more closely mimic a real physical ball. These ball mimicking variations have some advantages but also have a major disadvantage. It turns out to be necessary to compute second partial derivatives of C, and this can be quite costly. To see why it's costly, suppose we want to compute all the second partial derivatives. If there are million such variables, then we would compute something like a trillion second partial derivatives. That's going to be computationally costly. With that said, we are there are tricks for avoiding this kind of problem, and finding alternatives to gradient descent is an active area of investigation. But in this book, we'll use gradient descent and variations as a main approach to learning in neural networks. So, there's a side note that it's actually half a trillion. Still, you get the point, right? You have a lot to deal with. So, how can we apply gradient descent to learn in neural networks? The idea is to use gradient descent to find the weights WK and biases B, which minimize the cost. To see how this works, we'll reinstate the gradient descent update rule with the weights and biases replacing the variable Vj. In our words, our position now has components Wk and Bl, and the gradient of C has corresponding components del C with respect to Wk and del C with the partial derivative of C with respect to Bl. So now the update rules are so, and this is similar to the update rule here, right? Just instead of V, now you have those things, and similarly the other gradient of C is also changed. Now it's with respect to Wk and Bl. By repeatedly applying this update rule, we can roll down the hill and hopefully find the minimum of the cost function. In other words, this is a rule which can be used to learn in a neural network. So there are a number of challenges in applying gradient descent rule. We'll look into those in depth in later chapters, but for now I just want to mention one problem. To understand what the problem is, let us look back at the quadratic cost function. Notice that the cost function has the form 1 over n and then summation, that is, it averages over costs for individual training examples. In practice, to compute the gradient of C, we need to compute the gradients separately for each training input and then average them. Unfortunately, when the numbers are large, this can take a long time and occur slowly. I hope you get the point. Now, when there are a large number of gradients, you need to wait for each gradient to be computed, and then wait for the mean to be computed and all. So, another idea comes up here, which is the idea of stochastic gradient descent, which can be used to speed up learning. The idea is to estimate the gradient C by computing gradient Cx for a small sample of randomly chosen training inputs. By averaging over this small sample, it turns out that we can quickly get a good estimate of the true gradient, and this helps us speed up the gradient descent and thus learning. So instead of computing all trillion gradients and all, you're going to sample a small portion of them and work your way up. And empirically, it, and while working with this, it was observed that this helps speeding up, and the values are quite close to what the actual value would have been. So to make these ideas more precise, stochastic gradient descent works by randomly picking out a small number m of randomly chosen training inputs, and they label them as x1, x2 up to xm and refer to them as a mini batch. Provided the sample size m is large enough, we expect that the average value, the gradient cxj, will be roughly equal to the average of all overall delta cx. So they're trying to say that the gradient over xj's should the average of the gradients should approximate the real average. Now, where the second sum is this is the sum over the entire training data. So using this approximation relation, you can since this was what we wanted and this was what we approximated, we are saying that it would be reasonable enough to say that this is what this approximates to. So this confirms that we can estimate the overall gradient by computing gradient just for the randomly chosen mini batch. And now again the same stuff. We connect this explicitly to learning in neural networks. Suppose WK and BL denote the weights and biases in a neural network. Then stochastic gradient descent works by picking out a randomly chosen mini batch of training inputs and then training with those. So you can see that you are doing the same updating, but now the mean is over not every, like you're not going to average over everything, you are going to average only over the mini batch of M, where the sum are over all the training example xj in the current mini batch. Then we pick out another randomly chosen mini batch and train with those, and so on until we have exhausted training inputs, which is set to complete an epoch of training. At that point, we start over with a new epoch. So I hope this makes sense. So, incidentally, it's worth noting that conventions vary about scaling of cost function and of mini batch updates to the weights and biases. So, in equation 6, we scale the overall cost function by a factor 1 over n. People sometimes omit the 1 over n, summing over the cost of individual training examples instead of averaging. This is particularly useful when the number of training examples isn't known in advance. This can occur if more training data is being generated in real time, for instance. And in a similar way, the mini batch update rule sometimes omit the 1 over m term out the front of the sum. Conceptually, this makes little difference since it's equivalent to rescaling the learning rate, but when doing detailed comparisons of different works, it's worth watching out for. So you might wonder why removing this does not make a difference. Well, the eta is a constant as well, right? So uh, it might just be that you might end up adjusting the learning rate to account for not having the exact number of the not dividing by the size of the training set or the mini batch. So we can think of stochastic gradient descent as being like political polling. It's much easier to sample a small mini batch than it is to apply gradient descent to the full batch, just as carrying out a poll is easier than running a full election. That's a good analogy. For example, if we have a training set of 60,000 as in MNIST and choose a mini batch of M is equal to 10, this means we'll get a factor of 6,000 speed up in estimating the gradient. Of course, the estimate won't be perfect. There will be statistical fluctuations, but it doesn't need to be perfect. All we care about is moving in a general direction that will help decrease C. And that means we don't need an exact computation of the gradient. In practice, stochastic gradient descent is commonly used and powerful technique for learning in neural networks, and it is the basic for most of the learning techniques that we will develop in the book. Of course, now we have an exercise. An extreme version of the gradient descent is to use mini batch size of 1. That is, given a training example X, we update our weights and biases according to this rule. Then we choose another training input and update, and so on. This procedure is known as online or incremental learning. In online learning, a neural network learns from just one training example input at a time. Name one advantage, one disadvantage of online learning compared to stochastic gradient descent with say a mini batch size of 20. So the advantage would be, of course, it would be faster. The disadvantage would be, of course, that one gradient would not be an accurate representation. Like even when you do stochastic gradient descent, uh, even when you do stochastic gradient descent, you're approximating, right? But when you're taking a mean, it has a much more reasonable chance of being nearby to the correct or the uh, real mean. However, when you just take one of them, it does not really uh, make sure that it just isn't an outlier, which will ruin the step of batch of gradient descent. So let me conclude the section by discussing a point that sometimes bugs people new to gradient descent. In neural networks, the cost C is of course a function of many variables, all weights and biases. And so in some sense defining a surface is very high dimensional space. Yep. Some people get hung up thinking, hey, I have to be able to visualize all these extra dimensions, and they may start to worry. I can't think in 4 dimensions, let alone 5 or 5 million. Is there some special ability they are missing? some ability that real super mathematicians have? Of course, the answer is no. Even most professional mathematicians can't visualize four dimensional especially well, if at all. The trick they use instead is to develop some way of representing what's going on. That's exactly what we did above. We used an algebraic rather than visual representation of delta C to figure out how to move so as to decrease C. People who are good at thinking in higher dimension have a mental library containing many different techniques along these lines. Our algebraic trick is just one example. Those techniques may not have the simplicity we are accustomed to when visualizing three dimensions, but once you build up a library of such techniques, you can get pretty good at thinking in higher dimensions. I won't go into more details here, but if you're interested, then you may enjoy reading this discussion of some techniques professional mathematicians use in higher dimensions. While some of the techniques discussed are quite complex, much of the best content is intuitive and accessible and could be mastered by anyone. Oh, so this is a Maths Overflow post. Okay, so I guess you should read this. I'll also read this up, but not in the video. So thank you for joining in, and now we are really close to the real stuff, the crux of what we're going to do. So which is implementing everything, and I'll probably take one more video to cover this stuff. Hopefully, one more video would suffice to go over the code. So thank you guys for joining in. And again, if you have any suggestions, do comment them down below. Like, share, subscribe, all the usual stuff. And I'll catch you guys in the next video. Thank you.